Morning, everybody. It's Monday, April 27th, and it's our last multivariate lecture. So I just wanted to take a second and thank you guys all for bearing with me. Obviously, as we went online, that posed an additional challenge, but also for remaining so engaged throughout the semester. You guys have all continued to work at this. You guys have all tried hard. And the sense I get is that you seem to find the material interesting here, by and large, which I really do appreciate. It makes a big difference in terms of my motivation. And I hope that you walk away from this class feeling like you really got something out of it. So I do appreciate you all. IO folks, I'll see you guys probably sometime soon for our Zoom commencement. I'll send out an email about 690 at some point here. For all of us though, Selena, basically you, best of luck. And just for the agenda for the day, we don't have much. This week was supposed to be SEM and HLM. And those are both pretty big topics and pretty, they're big. They're semester-long classes in a lot of programs. So I decided today I'm just going to lecture on SEM and have that be really kind of our last lecture. I'll post the HLM slides in case you're interested, but it's one of those topics that I feel like people don't use as much in psychology. I personally think it's very useful and worth learning, but I don't know if recording another lecture and having you guys watch it for that kind of advanced topic that's not as applied is going to be as useful. So SEM this week, and there's no homework. Really, the only other thing you have to do for this class is get your projects in. I'll grade those, and that'll be it. It's weird. It feels really strange to be like, okay, cool, we're pretty much done. But that's the case. So again, yeah, I do very sincerely want to thank you all for making this one of my favorite classes to teach. Maybe my favorite class to teach. One of them. Yeah, it's up there. It's good. It's good. Okay. So with that said, let's talk about structural equation modeling, eh? So structural equation modeling is something that is used a fair amount, basically in place of regression. It's basically been put in place. Regression was used to basically, we've talked about this, test the effect of an IV on a DV. Structural equation, and there's lots of issues with regression, right? There's measurement error due to reliability. There's the fact that you can create some of these more interesting models, but you're still looking at combinations of variables, composite variables, right? You've got 5 job set items, you average them together. What is that? Is that really, are all 5 supposed to be given equal weight? What's going on there? And what we saw last week, 2 weeks ago with CFA is a different way to look at composite variables by putting the observed variables into a latent variable, figuring out how much measurement error we have, and then seeing how well the model fit. SEM just adds a layer to that. It's like adding regression onto that. Structural models let us draw relationships between those latent variables, and then it allows us to test the overall model fit. So we're not saying, is there a relationship here to here as much as saying we are proposing a series of relationships or a set of relationships, and does our proposed model fit the data? This makes sense in a lot of ways, right? In psychology, and I've said this time and time again, we oftentimes don't care about just 2 variables, right? The relationship between 2 variables. What we care about is oftentimes, as theories grow more complex sets of relationships, mediation, moderation, and so on and so forth. What SEM allows us to do is combine a lot of those different relationships together in a latent variable framework that lets us test complex things to see if our data matches it. It's a more rigorous test. So today we'll talk a little bit more about why SEM, talk briefly about CFAs again, talk about the components of structural models, and then spend a few minutes on latent growth modeling, which is a subtype of structural equation modeling. And it's all really cool stuff. This is probably, in the research that I do, what I fall back on more than anything else. I do a lot of the polynomial regression and response surface modeling stuff. I sometimes have to do HLM, but a lot of it ends up being SEM. So like I said, SEM is an extension of confirmatory factor analysis. It's basically, you start off with those, circles representing latent variables. We're basically putting arrows now from circle to circle. So when you run a structural model, you do it in 2 steps. You do it step 1, you do the CFA to say, are these latent variables actually latent variables? But step 2 then is there a relationship between them? Other names for this, people sometimes talk about path analysis. It's not really SEM. Path analysis is creating composite variables, not latent variables. So just averaging variables together and linking them. Covariance structure analysis is another term for SEM. No one I know uses that, or causal analysis. Some fields, like econometrics, I think, use that term. But to recap CFA briefly, we're establishing the factor structure for one or more latent variables. We want to see if we say these observed variables go to this latent variable, does that fit our data? Or is there something else maybe going on? We talked about model identification, and basically like your CFA has to fit. Otherwise, you're not confident that your data is doing what it should be doing, and you can't draw any causal conclusions from it. Let me put that a different way, because I think that's a valuable point. If your model doesn't fit what you think or hypothesize is happening, then it's not happening. This is a much more rigorous test than just doing regression, right? Regression, you're like, oh, well, I'll combine these variables, look at the reliability, and regress them onto one another. Significant, great. Here, you have to make sure your data fits it. And if it doesn't, if your data doesn't fit your CFA, you gotta try something else, right? You can't just kind of whistle on past that and say, well, we're going to conclude this, because your first major step hasn't been approved. But if it is, right, so if you get a CFA that fits, you can start to add in structure to it. Here's some types of questions you can ask about using SEM. You can do mediation tests, moderation tests, mediated moderation tests, or moderated mediation tests. Those are actually 2 separate things, and I won't get into how they're different. Basically, moderated mediation is fine, though mediated moderation theoretically doesn't make much sense. There's lots of articles on that. There's 3 articles on that I know of, maybe 3. So if you want to know more about that stuff, I'm happy to forward that on. But SEM can also do growth models. And this is what I find particularly useful, where you can model change over time. And SEM can also do multi-level models. So at least in my education, I used to hear about HLM, or hierarchical linear modeling, as the way to take into account nesting of data. So people nested within a team are not independent. Like, their job satisfaction is not totally independent because they're in the same team. Students nested in a classroom, their learning outcomes are not independent because they're in the same classroom. And it used to be that HLM was the only way to do this. You can actually do multi-level structural equation modeling, but that's know that exists, I guess, if you have nested data and want to do SEM, but we're not going to cover that in great depth here, because again, that's another course, like, on its own. So why is this gained popularity? And I'll put the caveat out there that some people, some fields, and I don't mean to totally rain on the parade for social psych, but social psych's starting to see this, but not as much as IO or management. And I would actually really strongly argue that most fields should be using this over regression because of issues like measurement error and unspecified models. Regression, you can throw a bunch of different regressions in there and build out a model, but you're not testing them simultaneously. SEM, you're making sure that the overall huge model fits with your data. So we can use latent variables. You can model a complex array of relationships simultaneously. And in doing so, you can test the overall model fit rather than the series of regressions. So this is good for testing a theoretical model. You can test causal relationships over time. And you can model advanced stuff that SPSS kind of does, but not great. If you have a bivariate relationship, fine, use regression. But most of the time, I'd say use SEM. It's a more stringent test. And by being more stringent, it lets us avoid publishing stuff that isn't replicable or that might not fit the data, but no one ever knows because they tested a regression. Things to be cautious of, though. You want to be cautious of model specification, right? You want to make sure you specify a priori beforehand what you think your interrelationships between your latent variables are. And then you want to run other plausible models, right? You want to say like, well, theory would say this, but maybe our IV and mediator could be switched. Or maybe, you know, whatever the switching around might be. You want to think of what else is plausible and run those models to demonstrate, hopefully, that what you thought of not only makes sense, but makes empirical sense more than other plausible models. A guy named John Antonakis, who's the editor of the Leadership Quarterly, talks a lot about this, about what he talks about as the endogeneity problem, where there's, especially if we have one time point of data, you can form any possible relationship in your correlation matrix, test it and make it look fancy and say that that's what's happening. That's not good. That's in fact pretty terrible. You want to make sure you're testing your alternatives to say that what you thought is going on is better than the possible random effects that might come up by mishmashing stuff together. Yeah, sorry, not to go on too much of a soapbox about that, but it's an issue as we try to make methodology and science better. So my patience for people that run 2 regressions and say this is all that's going on is, and don't include controls and don't test alternative models, is growing thin as a reviewer because there's so many other possibilities. Okay, that was a bit of a rant. So some programs are pretty, I'd be cautious of with doing SEM. Amos is an add-on to SPSS and is particularly guilty of this. It sets some defaults in there that you don't know what's going on. You basically draw out your model. I heard someone fairly ungenerously refer to Amos as it's like finger painting for SEM. Like you draw it out and it runs it. You don't quite know what's happening, but people use it because it's really easy. But they might not know what's going on in their model. I'd say you should do it. And R, obviously, in the Levant package, because that's what we're using in this course. But that's also becoming kind of the default gold standard. And we'll talk a little bit more about programs at the end. There's one other thing to be careful of. This is a very specific thing, but it's a little bit limited in how we analyze longitudinal data, in that you can do longitudinal growth analysis, but data points have to be collected at the same intervals, so every 2 weeks or every month. If the data collection is not at the same interval, you have to fall back on using HLM. And this last point actually isn't true anymore. M+ now has a Bayes estimator in the most recent version, but no one's using Bayes in psychology really, so don't worry about it. Okay, I'm going to talk about some terms, and I realize right now you're sitting here being like, okay, I kind of get what this does. I kind of get that Ben's ranting. What the heck is going on? So let's talk about some basic terminology, and then I'm going to show you guys a model. We have exogenous and endogenous variables. Exogenous variables are of an external origin. Nothing predicts them. They are just a variable that exists. And it's more what we'd use as a predictor. So something like biological sex would be exogenous. Nothing else is really predicting it. I'm genetics and blah, 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 but if you're going down that road, you're just shut up. So that would be exogenous. It's something that is probably a predictor. Endogenous is something that's more like a DV, but it can also point to other variables. So an endogenous variable is the result of something, but can also cause something else. As a result of this, it has error, right? If it's predicted by something, it is predicted imperfectly. Therefore, there's some unexplained variance in there that we model. This is again why this is so useful, is when we're modeling our latent variables, we model the error based on the reliability, but we can also model the error based on unexplained variance in our endogenous variables. So let's break this down, right? So if our traditional predictor that is exogenous, that'd be job stress right here. Job stress leads to burnout, which leads to intent to quit. This is kind of the mediation model that we've talked about before. Right now, burnout is endogenous because it has another arrow pointing to it, but it also leads to intent to quit. So that's endogenous too. So job stress is exogenous. It's our starting point. Burnout and intent to quit are exogenous because they're acting as DVs essentially. Oh God, okay, there we go. You'll notice I have two little, they look like circles with a line because that's exactly what they are. I have two little circles and lines for the endogenous variables. These are used in SEM notation to denote our disturbance terms or the error in the latent variables. Job stress doesn't have a disturbance term because we're not trying to explain variance in it. So there's no error there aside from what's from reliability that we have to model. We just model these disturbances that we talked about in our identification earlier in CFA for these secondary variables. So this is a really basic model. We have if we took these two lines out between job stress and burnout and between burnout and intent to quit, we just have a CFA basically. So if I were to run this, I'd run it as a CFA. I'd add those lines in and then test the indirect effect, and that would be a structural model. And I'd look at the fit. It's really that easy. You're really just putting arrows between your circles. But we break those types of arrows out in a few different ways. We can have association arrows. These are just correlations between latent variables. It's not specifying a direction, it's just saying, here's the zero order correlation. We can have direct relationships. This is those pretty basic lines. It's like a regression. We can have indirect effects. This is the effect of A on C through B. It's our mediation effect. And then when we look at this overall, we look at the individual weights for each relationship or the indirect effect. So we look at what's basically a regression weight or an A-B mediation effect or a correlation. But we do that when accounting for all these other variables in the model, if there's other variables in the model. We're not looking at these individually, we're taking them all together. And again, that's one big strength of using SEM. So in this case, this is a slightly more complex model. We have work-family conflict and job stress lead to burnout, which leads to intent to quit. We're testing basically two mediation effects here as one overall model. So let's break down what some of these arrows mean. We've got our observed variables, right? there's 3 for each because it's easier when I make these to copy and paste the same thing, to be 100% honest. We have 4 latent variables. We have 2 exogenous variables, work-family conflict and job stress, that lead to burnout as an endogenous variable and intent to quit as an endogenous variable. That's our base map. Now, what types of relationships or associations do we have here? We have a correlational association. We're letting work-family conflict and job stress correlate. They're both our predictors, but we suspect they're related. That's what theory would tell us, so we're letting them correlate. We have direct effects between work-family conflict and burnout, and between job stress and burnout. And we have a direct effect between burnout and intent to quit. What we don't have modeled here, but we probably would put in our syntax, is indirect effects as well. I'd want to test the indirect effect of work-family conflict to burnout to intent to quit. And I want to test the indirect effect of job stress to burnout to intent to quit. So basically 2 A-B coefficients. A times B and A times B. So the first A, work-family conflict to burnout. Second A, job stress to burnout. And B is going to be burnout to intent to quit. So we can test both mediation paths. And again, the advantage of doing this over how we did it even a few weeks ago is you're not testing these separately. You're testing this as an overall model and seeing how well it fits your data. So you get model fit, which we evaluate the same way we did the CFA, and you get these individual estimates for these paths. That's basic SEM in a fairly quick nutshell. And I think that hopefully it makes sense because it really just builds upon regression and CFA that we've already talked about. I do want to talk briefly about latent growth modeling because I think it's a lot of psychological phenomena are important to model over time. You know, people's attitude change over time, people's stress over time. If people are more stressed, are getting more stressed, does that make them quit? If people are stressed, they start stressed but are getting less stressed, does that make them happier, right? In other words, one person's level of something at a given time may not be as important as their trajectory or change over time. So for example, I'm working on a paper right now, I have been for what feels like forever, that looks at organizational culture through the Denison framework, so it's more culture is better, on turnover, basically. And we find that, yeah, at one point in time, or like culture in general, the better the culture is, the less turnover there is. But we find a larger effect or an incremental effect where, to an extent, it doesn't matter how good or bad your culture is. It matters if your culture is improving, you're less likely to turn over. If you perceive that your culture is getting worse, you're more likely to turn over. And we feel like that's a much more interesting finding and talking point than just better culture leads to less turnover. The other thing that I like to look at a lot with this stuff is, you know, as I get into the work and aging leaders thing is, like it'd be really cool, I haven't done this, but it'd be really cool to study like cognitive ability changes over time and how that relates to leadership effectiveness, or changes in communal behavior over time and how that relates to perceived warmth and competence, whatever it may be. There's lots of stuff that we have the ability to model over time that, if you think back to how we've done stuff before, it's, well, I'll get into that in a second. Real briefly, latent growth modeling, we model change over time. Our indicators, remember those starting variables, are observations at different time points. We model the slope, that's the change over time, and the intercept, that's the overall mean of the variable. And then we can predict other outcomes using the slope and intercept. Okay, this is the point I was going to make a second ago. Traditionally, we use different scores for longitudinal data. Your score at time 2 minus your score at time 1, or score at time 3 minus the score at time 2, or we use repeated measures framework. The problems with these approaches are that the mean is assumed to be 0, and you can't calculate a trajectory of change over time over more than 2 time points. So you really can't, you can get at how much of a difference there is. You can't get at the question of, does change over time in whatever you're looking at predict an outcome? Does change in culture predict turnover? Does change in satisfaction predict whatever? And Alicia Grandy did this study recently on daily stressors and drinking and after work, not at work. And they use latent growth modeling combined with some HLM techniques to basically say that if you're progressively more stressed over the course of a week, you're going to drink more and more. That's looking not just at how stressed are you, but also change, trajectory of stress. And it's a really valuable way to study kind of complex questions. But the way it's done is really simple. You've got 4 time points. Let's say, let's use stress and drinking, right? This is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? You're surveying me every day on stress. And you basically you create 2 latent variables. Call them whatever you want. You regress them onto each indicator and you let them correlate, and that forms your intercept and your slope. You can then use either one of these to predict an outcome. So here's my overall level of stress, but here's my stress change over the course of a week. And I can ask, does my trajectory of stress predict my drinking on Friday? So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if my stress is going up, maybe I drink more on Friday. If my stress somehow goes down throughout the week, which I don't know what that feels like, I'm sure it's nice, maybe my drinking goes down. Or maybe because we're in a pandemic, it stays the same. So that's latent growth modeling in a nutshell. Again, this is just to introduce you to the concept that this can be done, and it's actually not super difficult. And I think it's a very useful tool, but I also am often interested in questions of change over time. So, I think a lot of stuff that we look at statically, we change over time is a different lens we can apply. That's an important way to look at problems. And again, it's kind of my standard rant these days. Capturing stuff cross-sectionally at one point in time tells us about one person at one point in time, but as human beings, our behavior and our attitudes and stuff are not static, and capturing changes is important, not just from like a developmental psychology perspective, but overall. One last real brief topic, latent interactions or moderation in SEM is shockingly difficult to do. You used to be able to do this in Listro, but it took like 10 pages, like 10 typed out pages of code, and it was awful. M+ does this okay. And Levon is getting better at it. It's still not perfect. If you end up wanting to do moderation in SEM, talk to me and I'll figure out what the latest research is. I try to avoid it. And I'm throwing some of these terms around. Sorry, this text is kind of small. Program options. Listrel used to be the traditional program used for SEM. Came out in the early 90s, maybe late 80s. You had to literally program your matrices, like 0, 1, 0, 0, 1. There's 4 different matrices for a basic model. We're not going to get into it. Terrible. I had to learn this in grad school, and it was terrible. I cannot express how much I hate that program. EQS is another program developed by Peter Bentler, who came up with the CFI index. I've never used it. I don't know anyone that does. Amos is one that I see cited in papers more than I'd like. It's an add-on to SPSS. If you know what you're doing, it's probably fine. I don't know anyone who enjoys using it because it sets so many defaults. And if you want to run a model correctly, you have to learn to program it in anyway. And at that point, you might as well use something that's free, which is R, right? We end where we began. The SEM package is okay. The Lavon package is becoming really, really good. A couple of years ago, it was pretty good. They keep updating it. It keeps getting better. I'm personally trying to force myself for all my projects that use SEM to use Lavon. I used to use M+ a ton, but I'm trying to force everything to Lavon at this point because I think it's really good. And then there's M+, which I can show you guys in a second. It's really good, but syntax is easy, but it's learning a new programming. It's learning a new program and its language. But you can do almost everything. But the only thing really that M+ does well that Lavon doesn't at this point is multi-level SEM stuff. And if you're going down that road, then that's a whole other thing. So I've included here some script for Lavon. This should look familiar. We specify a model, we fit it, we get our fit statistics. The only difference between what we did last time is these regressions. Latent variable 2 gets regressed onto latent variable 1, latent variable 3 gets regressed onto both. If you think back to a diagram, right? All this is adding in lines between our circles. We define our latent variables, we've done that. We add the lines in. We sometimes let these residual correlations happen, but we shouldn't do that. And then we run it. It's simple. And if you want to do mediation, you just specify, and we won't get into this too much, but your A/B coefficient, you have to kind of write it out and run it and add the bootstrap. If you want to do that, you could probably modify the syntax pretty quickly to do that. And here's a quick Lavon latent growth model example. Again, I've got it in here just because we're not actually going to run this stuff. I don't have easy data to really run this stuff with right now, and I don't want to honestly generate data to go through this. But this is the basic idea of how it would work. So hopefully, perhaps maybe you could read this. Certainly this one, maybe this one, and maybe this, and understand what's happening for it. And at the end here, I just have some examples of M+ syntax. So that's what M+ looks like if you ever need to use it. But I suspect in whatever you all do next, if you end up having to do any of this stuff, you can do it in Lavon and R for free and fairly easily. Okay, so that's it, folks. I just wanted that to be a really brief overview of what SEM is and some of the stuff you can do with it. I really want to emphasize for any of this stuff, if you go out to further schooling, onto a professional career, I know even some of the IOs are doing some of these different things, and you want or have questions about this or run into something, reach out. I may not know the answer, but I can try to help you find it, and that's honestly fun for me. Like I realize that some of the days that I enjoyed the most, especially in quarantine now, are just running data and playing with R. There's actually, let me show you guys this real quick. There's a woman who's teaches stuff in R in Australia, who I follow on Twitter a fair amount, who has this, you guys can't see my screen, can you? God damn it. So she has this program called Flametree in R. It's a package. Share. It's a program called Flametree where it has R automatically generate, and you set the parameters, different types of art through data generation and then visualization in R. So that's really apropos of nothing, but I came across that last night and was like, this is so cool. Um, yeah, okay, wow. We wrapped up fairly quick. We're at 35 minutes, and I'm not going to go into the HLM stuff. I think the amount that it would hurt everyone's brain, mine included, to go through it, honestly, at the end of the semester isn't worth it. So I'm looking up, we're not doing course evals, by the way, but I may send something out. I think some people have put together an informal course eval um, that they want to give out, or that people can give out. It's not going to go on, hopefully I'm getting freaking tenure in a month or two anyway, but like it's not going to go on my record or anything. I might send that out because I am curious about feedback. This is the first time that I've taught this course in 2 years. As I said at the beginning of the semester, it's a total redesign. Like I broke everything down from the ground up and kind of redid it so that it fits with the tidyverse, and I just trying to figure out how to teach R better. So I'd really like your guys's commentary on how that went and what could be improved. Obviously taking into account global pandemic and all that. But yeah, cool. Thank you all again so much. Reach out, and I really enjoyed teaching you guys this semester more than any other semester that I've taught this class. Everyone was so generally stoked on learning R and learning more about data. And I contrast that to my first year here in 2015 when I taught it, and I think Jay was the main one who was teaching stat at the time, and they basically were like, we hate statistics, we hate learning, we don't understand why we need to know this. And I was like, guys, it's important. And I was brand new, and they're like, yeah, we don't believe you. So I had so much resistance, really my first 2 years of teaching this course. And it's so refreshing after not teaching it for another year to have a group that's into it. That makes a big difference. So I'm rambling at this point. Thank you all very much, and take care. I'm looking forward to seeing your projects.